Antecedent interventions modify what precedes the behavior rather than the consequence that follows behavior. Most of the time, you will be modifying the environmental variables that are responsible for evoking problem behavior. The goal of the antecedent-based intervention is to increase motivation to engage in appropriate behavior while decreasing motivation to engage in problem behavior. In this module, we will review a variety of antecedent-based interventions that have been developed in order to decrease motivation to engage in challenging behavior. Implementing antecedent-based interventions makes us look at the conditions that make the individual engage in either appropriate or inappropriate behavior. This gives us information about the changes that are needed to make appropriate behavior more likely. Next, we will review antecedent-based interventions that are available to us. Non-contingent reinforcement, or NCR, is an intervention that consists of delivering a reinforcer that maintains problem behavior, independent of the occurrence of that problem behavior. This strategy is particularly effective at decreasing problem behavior maintained by attention or escape. NCR decreases problem behavior because the reinforce is delivered freely and frequently. As a result, the individual does not need to engage in problem behavior to access the reinforcer. For example, aggression maintained by escape is likely to decrease using an NCR intervention where a break from instructional tasks is provided at regular intervals. NCR for problem behaviors maintained by positive reinforcement would consist of providing access to attention or tangible items on a regular schedule, while NCR for problem behaviors maintained by negative reinforcement, also called non-contingent escape, would then consist of providing breaks from instructional tasks on regularly scheduled intervals. To successfully implement non-contingent reinforcement, you will first need to identify the reinforcer that is maintaining the problem behavior. Next, you will need to determine the reinforcement interval. In order to be effective, the initial rate of access to the reinforcer during the intervention should be dense. That is, it should happen more frequently than when the individual engages in problem behavior. To determine when to deliver the reinforcer, look at the data regarding the occurrence of problem behavior. Reinforcement should initially occur more frequently on average than the average occurrence of problem behavior. This means that the schedule of reinforcement will be dense. Once problem behavior occurrences significantly drop, systematically increase that interval of time between reinforcers. Start with a fixed schedule of reinforcement. That is, initially deliver the reinforcer after a set interval of time, 10 minutes for example. In this example, every 10 minutes, the individual will get access to reinforcement, regardless of whether problem behavior is emitted at the time. As the level of problem behavior stabilizes at a lower level, gradually increase that interval, for example, going from 10 to 15 minutes, then 20 and 30. Ultimately, it's recommended to switch to a variable schedule of reinforcement, where the reinforcement is delivered, for example, every 45 minutes on average. Using a variable schedule of reinforcement makes it more likely that the problem behavior will stay at a lower level in the long run. To determine when to deliver the reinforcer, look at the data regarding the occurrence of problem behavior. Reinforcement should initially occur more frequently on average than the average occurrence of problem behavior. This means that the schedule of reinforcement will be dense. Once problem behavior occurrences significantly drop, systematically increase that interval of time between reinforcers. Start with a fixed schedule of reinforcement. That is, initially deliver the reinforcer after a set interval of time, 10 minutes for example. In this example, every 10 minutes, the individual will get access to reinforcement, regardless of whether problem behavior is emitted at the time. As the level of problem behavior stabilizes at a lower level, gradually increase that interval, for example, going from 10 to 15 minutes, then 20 and 30. Ultimately, it's recommended to switch to a variable schedule of reinforcement, where the reinforcement is delivered, for example, every 45 minutes on average. Using a variable schedule of reinforcement makes it more likely that the problem behavior will stay at a lower level in the long run. An example of the application of NCR for problem behavior maintained by attention would be delivering praise or positive comments at the end of the interval. Initially, reinforcement will need to happen more often than the problem behavior occurred in the baseline in order to be very effective. A good rule of thumb to stick to when you're establishing an initial interval for reinforcement is using 50% of the baseline frequency or rate. To summarize, NCR is an antecedent-based intervention that allows you to provide access to reinforcement without any response requirement, and it's effective in reducing problem behavior. While it may be used without extinction, this makes it more likely that the problem behavior results in reinforcement. Additionally, periods of access to reinforcement can be disruptive to ongoing activities and should be anticipated. Next, we will discuss environmental modifications. These can be used in the classroom or the home, and oftentimes use schedules with pictures and can include rule charts. You can also structure the time that an individual engages in an activity by using a timer. Examples of environmental modifications that can be made to promote appropriate behaviors are balancing activities throughout the day, so alternating between large and small group activities, alternating between active and passive lessons, and alternating between easy and difficult tasks. Other modifications include implementing schedules consistently to make life predictable, but also modifying those regularly to promote flexibility. If changes to the schedule need to be made, it may be beneficial to give a warning. Use visual cues and warnings for transitions. Using pictures can also be helpful to let individuals know what to do across and within activities. Environmental modifications are easy to implement and may be beneficial for the individuals with whom you are working. However, since there is no programmed consequence for problem behavior, it may be useful to combine this with other interventions. As certain tasks become aversive to learners due to the nature of the content or the teaching procedures used, altering those features can help eliminate or reduce problem behaviors maintained by escape from instructional stimuli. Curricular revisions can be based on several aspects of the content. For example, some individuals might lack the prerequisite skills to perform a task. Teaching those prerequisite skills separately may make the task less aversive to the student. Additionally, content might need to be revised to increase or decrease the difficulty of the task, so that the task is challenging enough not to be boring, but easy enough to not seem impossible. Instructional revision involves assessing the way that the content is taught. Making changes to the aspects such as the pace at which instructions are delivered, the duration of the task, or the teaching format, for examples, are adjustments that could be made in order to support appropriate behavior. Making curricular and instructional revisions can be a useful way to improve teaching methods and increase skill acquisition for the individuals as well for others. However, anticipate that time and effort will be needed in order to review the instructional content and the procedures that you use to teach it. Demand fading is another antecedent-based strategy that is effective for severe problem behavior maintained by escape. Demand fading consists of removing all demands and then gradually and progressively reintroducing them. The goal of removing all instruction is to get an immediate reduction in problem behavior, while gradually reintroducing those instructions should increase tolerance to those instructions. It is important to note that the reintroduction of instructions should be based on the non-occurrence of problem behavior. To implement demand fading successfully, you will need to first identify what reinforcer is maintaining the problem behavior. If escape is the function, you will need to determine how instructions will be reintroduced and how compliance with demands will be reinforced. Here is an example of a demand fading procedure implemented for aggressive behavior towards staff that is maintained by escape during work. It consists of removing all demands at first, and then gradually reintroducing instructions. Initially, the schedule of reinforcement should be dense for completing one of the tasks. Gradually increase the work requirement, and that should be done until a reasonable work-break ratio is reached. Demand fading is an intervention which by definition allows for a quick reduction in problem behavior maintained by escape, since all demands are removed. This procedure is especially useful for dangerous behaviors that can be difficult to manage using other procedures. The systematic reintroduction of instructions might be helpful to increase the individual's tolerance to demands, but you should always make sure that the curriculum or work requirements are appropriate for the individual's level of functioning. Furthermore, periods of non-instruction might be disruptive in group settings and need to be anticipated. Activity choice involves giving the learner opportunities to make decisions about what activity comes next or when it comes. Activity choice is helpful in increasing compliance and promoting decision-making skills. To successfully implement this intervention, you first need to decide and plan for the choices that will be made available to the individual. Initially, start with simple, concrete choices. Gradually increase the complexity of those choices depending on the individual's choice-making abilities, and then reinforce the choice by giving access to the option they have selected. Some examples of choices that can be made available involve order of task or activity, location, or materials used. At home, decisions regarding homework, bedtime routine, chores, or food can be helpful in increasing compliance. While in school, decisions regarding materials used to complete an activity or task order may be effective in decreasing motivation to engage in problem behavior. Implementing an activity choice intervention may increase compliance without a significant loss of instructional time, but it does not include any specific consequences for problem behavior, which means it may be most effective when used with other consequence-based interventions. Be sure that the individual you are working with has prerequisite skills needed to make choices. The high probability request sequence is a strategy that consists of manipulating the order in which instructions are presented. Instructions can be separated as two types. Either they are easy to follow with a high probability of compliance, or they can be difficult or new tasks, and these are low probability requests. Presenting a series of easy requests before presenting the target instruction, the low probability request, makes this individual less likely to engage in problem behavior. In order to implement the high probability request sequence, you will first need to identify a series of high probability requests, as well as low probability requests. Plan for activities with embedded high probability requests. Deliver 3 to 5 high probability requests in rapid succession, then immediately present the low probability request, following compliance with the high probability requests. For example, if the target request is for the student to complete an assignment independently, asking the student to pass the assignment sheets to his peers or write his name on the assignment are examples of high P requests that can be used first to build momentum. It helps if we define high probability requests. High probability requests are requests that are being followed about 80% of the time on the first request. Low probability requests are less likely to be complied with or tend to generate problem behavior. High probability request sequences are an effective strategy to promote compliance with difficult tasks or transitions. In order to be successfully implemented, instructions will need to be planned in advance. While all of the interventions presented so far are useful for problem behavior maintained by social reinforcement, such as access to attention or escape, environmental enrichment can also be a useful intervention for behavior maintained by automatic reinforcement. The goal of environmental enrichment is to decrease problem behavior maintained by automatic reinforcement by making preferred items or activities available on a continuous, response-independent basis. That means they don't have to complete any specific behavior in order to access those. Because of this, the individual is less likely to engage in problem behavior that comes to interfere with learning and daily functioning. In order to implement this intervention successfully, you will first need to identify what is maintaining the problem behavior. Next, you might also need to perform a stimulus preference assessment with a variety of functionally equivalent but more appropriate materials or activities. Finally, you will need to identify contexts where access to these items or activities will be provided. Environmental enrichment is a strategy that is appropriate for problem behavior maintained by automatic reinforcement and is easy to implement because it involves no response requirement for the individual. If this intervention disrupts ongoing activities, consider designing time periods with access to reinforcement. To summarize, the goal of antecedent-based interventions is to increase motivation to engage in appropriate behavior while decreasing motivation to engage in problem behavior. Increasing access to preferred items, activities, or social interactions, modifying instructions to reduce escape, or providing choice and visual supports are a few interventions that are useful to support appropriate behavior.